Hello and welcome to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard. Thank you so much for joining us for another segment. In this segment, we're going to be having a conversation with Leanne Larson and Matthew Gordon. Now, for patients suffering from rare diseases, the limited number of breakthrough treatments has hindered improvements to their quality of life. Well, Leanne and Matthew are joining us here to talk about real-world evidence and how this real-world evidence can give developers and patients some semblance of hope. They're joining us here from Parexel. Thank you both for joining us, Leanne Larson and Matthew Gordon.
Good morning, Neil.
Good morning, Neil. Thank you for having us.
Leanne, if you would give us a bit of your professional background and talk briefly about your role at Parexel. And Matthew, if you would do the same for us.
Certainly. So, Neil, I've been working in the field of real-world evidence, although it's gone by different names over the years, for about 25 years, and have approached it from the provider perspective as well as the consulting CRO side and even in industry. I've been at Parexel leading real-world evidence for about 10 years now, and so have been able to advance, contribute to advancing the science and the work that we're doing in that space. Matthew?
Thanks. And Matthew Gordon, I'm Vice President of Real-World Evidence at Parexel. Been with Parexel in total for about 5 years, but in the industry for just about, I guess it's over 20 years at this point. Fortunately, many of those years with Leanne looking at the evolution and development of real-world evidence to support products and really help move the science forward.
Most clinical trials have some type of recruitment or retention challenges, but when it comes to rare disease trials, they offer some unique challenges. What is real-world evidence, and how can it be leveraged in some of these clinical trials for rare diseases?
It's an interesting question because I think the definitions are often a question today, and people use different terms and different names, and they use them interchangeably. But there really is a difference between real-world data and real-world evidence that I would want to highlight. Real-world data is essentially the raw data. It's the ingredients, so to speak, for the analysis. Those data, real-world data, can come from a variety of different existing sources, or some sources that are more prospective. They can come from things like electronic health records, medical claims and billing data. It can come from even wearables and sensors, but it can also be gathered from prospective observational real-world studies like patient registries. And when you have those data, then the real-world evidence is generated when you interpret and analyze those data and transform that into the evidence, into the meaningful information that can help support decisions. So I think it's important to note that there is a difference between those two. The real-world data in of themselves aren't as valuable. They don't answer the questions. It's the evidence that comes from the interpretation and the analysis. So I think I'd like to start there. The potential around real-world evidence, or how it can be used in trials or in research as a whole, is really around the ability to better understand the complexity of care and the complexity of patient outcomes. Traditional randomized clinical trials, while they're absolutely essential to what we do, it's essential to developing products, they don't answer some questions. They're a much more homogeneous patient population that's very controlled in terms of the kinds of experiences they have and the way in which they're treated. But we know that in the real world, life is much more complex than that, and very few people look like the patients who are in a clinical trial. So the real world evidence and the various ways in which we capture that gives us an opportunity to see more effectively the real picture of what happens with patients when they're being treated for their condition. I think it brings a couple of different benefits to a clinical trial in particular. It can help us identify patients and treating physicians, particularly in rare diseases. When we can look at large data sets that cross geographies and payers and populations, we're able to find patients in a way that a much more narrow study might not be able to. We can also use these data to optimize a protocol. It can help us understand going into a protocol whether the study design is feasible. Do those patients really exist? Will this study actually work? We also can do natural history studies, which are a very, very, I think, important benefit of real-world evidence. Natural history study can be really critical, both in finding the patients and also in understanding what's happening within that condition and with those patients. It really offers us some excellent opportunities around that. And they are a really important part of real-world evidence, both in the pre-approval period as well as after approval. It helps us understand the burden of illness, the cost of illness, the outcomes that happen with patients. And that's an important point because drug development and developing new treatments for patients, particularly in rare diseases, it's not just about getting the drug approved, it's about ensuring the patients actually have access to it, that someone's going to reimburse it and pay for it. So having that full range of information is critical. And then the last thing that I would mention with real-world evidence, and I think this is also particularly important in a rare disease setting, is external control arms. It's an opportunity to use existing data or data outside of the trial as the control to a phase 2 or 3 trial, for instance. That can really help accelerate the study because you don't have to enroll twice as many patients, essentially. It can also be a lot more attractive, appealing, and comfortable to patients because they don't run the risk of being randomized to a placebo, for instance, or to a treatment that they feel might be less effective than the innovative drug being studied. So I think this opportunity for external control arms is really important in real-world evidence, and we're seeing a tremendous amount of interest in that today. So hopefully that gives you some background on where we think RWE fits within the overarching clinical research environment.
Where do you see the acceptance of this real-world evidence when it comes to addressing the issue of so few treatments for rare diseases?
Well, I think the interest is really growing. You know, as Matthew and I both mentioned, we've been doing this for a very, very long time and have seen the evolution of this grow and evolve. You know, we have seen the days when it wasn't well respected to now being an environment where it can be used to answer questions for the FDA, for top-tier peer-reviewed journals. And in particular in rare diseases, when I think stakeholders like the FDA and the other agencies around the world recognize that these studies are really challenging. It's very hard to find these patients. And it's critical that we create a world where we can actually develop these drugs as quickly as possible, these new treatments. So I think that we're seeing a real increase in the acceptance of real-world evidence in this environment in particular. Now, obviously, it has to come with the appropriate and critical level of rigor and scientific depth and strength that you need to have for this kind of research and to answer these really important questions. But these studies, when they're done well, and they typically are these days, we have a lot of experience, I think, in ensuring that we're developing high-quality studies. When they're done well, they can answer these questions in a way that it really helps us. You know, the acceptance within the rare disease community has really grown. But in the larger sense, the acceptance of RWE is driven by a number of some other important factors, which include, for instance, we have much better access to data today in general. We have much stronger analytic methods that allow us to interpret those data more effectively. And then finally, we have, you know, an appreciation for the value that these data bring that we didn't have, 10 years ago. And that it allows us to do some very important things, that real-world evidence answers questions that clinical trials just can't answer. And that's what underlies the value that it brings to rare diseases.
What are your thoughts, Matthew, on how the FDA is going to have to change its structure in order to better use this real-world evidence that Leanne's talking about?
I'm not an expert in FDA structure. I'll state that for the record, but I will say that they're understanding the use of real-world data and having the appropriate experience and knowledge base to understand how this data can be used and understand the caveats associated with these large data sets and, how it's collected and those challenges. I think we're actually seeing the FDA shift to an understanding that they're starting to provide guidance and really help provide a roadmap for manufacturers to understand how this data can be used within the overall development life cycle of a product. So I think we are seeing that shift, Neil. The fact that the guidance that has come out has been providing manufacturers with the at least somewhat of a roadmap and providing them the path for how they need to set up meetings and really think about how to incorporate this data into protocol design. I think that we're starting to see the FDA really shift in that evolution to using this data.
Well, if you would, give us a website where we can learn more about Parexel.
Yeah, Neil, the website for Parexel is www.parexel.com, and you can find there much more information on our perspectives around this, some of the publications, the team that we're bringing to the industry, I think, to help answer these questions.
Well, I appreciate both of you joining us here on Health Professional Radio. Leanne Larson and Matthew Gordon, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Neil.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, in conversation with Leanne Larson and Matthew Gordon of Parexel. Audio copies of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, listen in, download at SoundCloud, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com, Health Professional Radio.